St. Martin's in the Bullring stands on the site of a medieval village. It is a Grade II listed building and is known as the Mother Church of Birmingham. It was built in 1873 and is an example of Gothic Victorian architecture. There has been a church on this site since 1290 and may well have been a simple place of worship here in Saxon times. St. Martin's is also a place of worship for a thriving community who refurbished the building in 2000, making it more light and open. The video was recorded on the 17th of September 2021 as part of the city's Heritage Open Week. This video is a guided tour by a member of the church.
St. Martin's was known as, it is known as the Mother Church of Birmingham, and technically my title is Rector of Birmingham, which is terribly pompous and grand, isn't it? But that's because this was the Mother Church. But sometimes it's just known as the Cathedral of the Bullring, and so it became quite separate. And this was seen very much more where ordinary people were. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, but you just prompted another question.
Yeah.
Are we okay? Sorry.
Yeah, no, far away. I love questions.
We were at St. Paul's earlier this week.
Yes.
In the Jewellery Quarter.
Yes.
And the Reverend there, David.
David, yeah.
You friends?
Well, I don't know David well. I know him a little bit. Yes, I know David a little bit.
But he described St. Paul's, and I can't remember the name, the adjective. It was a something church. Easement?
The Chapel of Ease, was it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
The Chapel of Ease for, and he mentioned...
So that means originally it wouldn't have been a parish church.
Okay. I meant to ask him, but we...
Yeah,
we
so
didn't.
I'm not, this is not a part of the history of the church structures I know well. I think what that meant was that they were built because there were just too many people, but they weren't necessarily a separate parish church, not originally.
So to take the pressure off, sort of thing, yeah?
Yeah, to
ease
provide
the
more
pressure,
space.
yeah.
And the Victorians particularly, when there was the massive industrialisation and the explosion of all the big cities, of course nearly all the churches in England were village churches. They go way back. And of course when I say this was the only church in Birmingham, that's Birmingham as it was. And there are lots of bits of what we think of as Birmingham now who would have had their own churches, but they were a village church with their own history.
Aston Parish?
So Aston Parish, I mean, I don't know how far back Aston Parish goes, but it goes back a long way, doesn't it? I think maybe St. Peter's Harborne, one of the Harborne ones also goes back a long, long way. But they were village churches. And as these cities grew, particularly the Victorians, they just built churches everywhere, probably built far too many. And we would love to think that all these churches were all packed. But actually there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest in some of the big cities like Manchester, Birmingham, London, they built too many churches. Yeah. And actually that's been a problem for the modern church because we've had too many buildings to look after. But actually when you think about it, if you go into any village, nearly every village still has its own village church.
With the pub not
What
far
people
away.
don't realise that actually, and with the pub just around the corner. Well, the choir have got to go somewhere, haven't they? So, but actually most cities have lost huge numbers of churches. And people don't realise that. So actually a lot of our city churches have had very short lives. They were built in the Victorian era, gone by the 60s.
I'm sorry, there's no sign of a graveyard.
No. Can we come back to that a bit
Yes, of
later?
course,
Is that all right?
yeah.
I will talk about that.
Yeah,
We'll talk about that a
Good
bit later. Is that all right?
observation.
No, it's good. No, very good. Well spotted. Very spotted. This is known as the Guild Chapel that we're standing in now. And the Guild is quite interesting. It dates from the late 14th century. And it was set up by men and interestingly and women, which we believe would have been very unusual back then. And it was a the guilds were set up to support different trades. So often you had a guild for a particular trade, but the Birmingham Guild covered a number of different trades. And this is depicted in the artwork that you see here today. And what's quite interesting, if you look at the bottom panel, midwifery. And we think that would have been very, very exceptional back in that time. So, what year was that? So that would have been 1383 it was set up. And that functioned for quite a number of years. And Michael, who's here to my left, was telling us a little earlier that when the guild was wound up at the time of Henry VIII, then his successor, his son Edward VI, Birmingham managed to claw back some of that money, and that what paid for the foundation of the King Edward schools here in Birmingham.
So the trades, obviously.
So we've got organs. Some of these would have been later. They wouldn't. I'm pretty sure that, for instance, they would not have been making organs in the late 14th century.
Right.
I'm pretty sure of that.
I think it's just a symbolic.
It's symbolic. It's music, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Music, then you've got
So-
obviously the midwifery, you've got
Nursing.
nursing,
Building.
building,
I'm not sure about the chap at the top. It looks like a town crier.
entertainer, maybe. And the one on
The one on the right
top
has some sort of architecture, I think.
because you can see the
building and
canals
design.
yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
And the chapel as it exists at the moment is quite interesting because this was sort of set up as it is now only in the 50s. And this is to do with this little monument here. So this chap here, James Neil Thorne, was actually American, but he flew with the RAF. And he flew in the very famous Arnhem flights when they landed all the troops in Holland to try and get behind the enemy lines. If you've ever seen the movie The Bridge Too Far,
Yeah.
so he was killed in that action. And what we now know is that in the 50s his family paid for this to be set up as it is now. The last group were asking us why, what was the connection? And that's a good question, and we don't know the answer to that, so we'll have to find out. Michael had a thought though, is that actually the rector at the time, Brian Green, did a lot of work in America and lots of connections. So it's possible that he met their family somewhere in the States, and because of that, that may be why they connected with St Martin's.
Can I just say, when we went to St Paul's, part of that was the fact that someone from there had gone over to America to raise funds.
The style
Okay.
of the church.
And
the
that's,
building.
and that's because
Right.
America got the same sort of style church.
Yes, right.
And he got a lot of donations from America.
Okay,
So there's
interesting.
quite a connection with America
Okay,
in St
and yeah.
Paul's.
Yeah, so I didn't know that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know, personally, I don't know any of the history about St Paul's, apart from it being in the jewellery quarter.
Yes.
You may also just want to note the painting in the corner, which is a depiction of the air raids here in Birmingham, and beneath it is a roll of honour of those who lost their life. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute, but we can move across into the other part of the building. So, okay. So we just
I think it's blocked for it because people didn't have watches and clocks of their own, so it's important to have a clock on the outside for it.
Of course,
in
yeah.
chapels and
Of
churches.
course, yeah.
Generally,
yes,
I think that's what they're doing.
yes,
It's the,
Michael. Bless you.
and
Yes, all right.
So,
All right,
thank
bless
for
you.
all
Thanks,
your-
Michael. No, it's lovely to see you. And say hello to Jean for me.
Yes, I will indeed. And I'm
Yes.
sorry I can't.
No, that's
But
great. Thank
I've
you.
got the Schoenberg special memory.
It just goes round to the right.
Yes. All right. So ready to start your position? Yeah. All right. Well, I hope that goes really well. All right. Bless you, Michael. Thank you. Yes. See you Sunday. Thank you. So here now, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the shape of churches. I don't know whether you know, but these Gothic churches were nearly always made in the shape of a cross. You come through the main part of the church, they call it the nave, then you come up into the chancel, and then the sanctuary. And then the little bits that stick out either side are known as the transepts. And that's true in most of these Gothic cathedrals or big churches. So we're now up in sort of right by the edge of the sanctuary. Sometimes this is known as the communion table or the high altar. And behind it you've got another alabaster sculpture which was put in 1874, just as the new building would have been kind of completed. And it depicts events leading up to just before Jesus' crucifixion. So I don't know whether you know the story, but the left-hand panel, you've got Jesus on the donkey riding into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Next to that, you've got him clearing out the temple, because when he arrived in Jerusalem, he found the temple was full of market traders. And so he said, look, this is supposed to be a place of prayer, so he tried to drive them out. That's it. The middle three panels are a depiction of the Lord's Supper, very influenced by Da Vinci. It probably didn't look anything like that, but that's what happened with European art. You know, they depict the Christian faith and people like Jesus in very particular ways, and that's tended to stick. Probably wasn't like that at all. The next panel I quite like, because there you've got Jesus. After the Lord's Supper, he took them out to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he asked the disciples to pray with him. And the story goes that as he asked them, they all fell asleep after a big meal, as we all tend to do. And that's where we get the phrase, the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. And then the last panel is Judas betraying Jesus with a kiss. So when they came to arrest Jesus in the darkness, in order that they could know who it was, Judas said, I will kiss the one that's Jesus, so you know who to arrest. Above it is our east window, and I wonder if there's anything you particularly notice about the east window.
Well, it's got the services in one. Is that
Yeah.
services are there? There
Yeah.
are farm
Yeah.
workers.
Yeah. So that's the
depicted-
key thing, yeah.
Yeah.
So those are very contemporary characters. And the reason being is that in the Second World War, when the bombing started in Birmingham, all the stained glass window in St Martin's, bar one, was shattered. And I've got this little picture here. Structurally, the building wasn't damaged too much. There was a little bit of damage at the west end and at the base of the tower. But the big problem was that all the stained glass was just blown out, literally gone. And so they lost all the windows except one, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute. So this was put in after the Second World War, and it's quite deliberately designed to represent new life and hope after the destruction of war. And so in the centre you've got the cross, but interestingly out of the cross is emanating light, but also it's covered in a vine. And you see the vine and all the grapes? So the grapes and the vine are supposed to represent new growth after all the destruction. So you've had everything destroyed, but actually there's hope and there's growth and there's life. And in the Bible, the grapes always represent and the vine. So Jesus said, I am the vine, and it's a representation of health and life and growth and good things. So when they talk about fruit, anything that is good qualities. And so around that, you've got lots of biblical stories that are all to do with healings. If you look very carefully, you can see the writing underneath each of the pictures. So bottom left there, the Good Samaritan and various ones there. Yeah, that's it. So the healing of the man at the pool, Christ restores Bartimaeus' sight. They're all pictures of healing. And then at the bottom, you've got all these figures that represent contemporary figures of Birmingham and the world in the 1940s and 50s. And so this window was designed to represent the healing of Birmingham after the destruction of war. After all the death, after all the wreckage, we need hope. We need something to look forward to, positive. And that's what this represents. So artistically, I can't tell you whether it's a good piece of stained glass or not, but I love the theme of it. I love the theme of it. It's very
And who
powerful.
designed it? Or is
So,
it more than one designer?
No, I'm glad you asked me that question because I can't remember the guy's name. No, it was there is a particular designer. I think his name was something Edward. Edward's his surname, and I know I should remember that, and I can't.
Edward Byrne?
But anyway,
The Edward Byrne?
no, I'll show you the Burns-Jones in a minute. That's a different one. But
Okay.
yeah,
Sorry, so these have to be specially cleaned?
they're very difficult to clean. Full stop.
So because you see a lot of stained glass and it's been up there many
Yeah.
years, and generally
Yeah.
it's like this. You can still see through it. And
It's extremely difficult to clean. So that window is probably very dirty. And actually, if it was clean, it'd be a lot brighter than it is now.
and that could, well, it looks great, doesn't it? But
Yeah, no, it does look
Yeah.
great. It does look great.
yeah.
But it also explains that when you look around, most of the windows are just bare glass because so much of it was destroyed with the bombing.
Oh, yes.
So there's a lot going on with that window. How big is it? What are the dimensions? Would you know?
So looking at it, no, I don't know what the dimensions are. So what we're talking what, about 4 meters wide, 4.5 meters wide.
Okay,
And my
right.
guess would be that you're talking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 meters in height,
Right.
5 to 6 meters in height, I think.
So it's sort of portrait and large.
Yes, portrait.
Yes,
orientation.
yes,
Yeah.
definitely. That's right. Yeah,
It's a big one.
proportions. Yeah, your proportions. Yeah, no, it's pretty big. It is pretty big. Okay, God bless. If you then just stay standing where we are, a few things that would be worth pointing out whilst we're here. Up above us are these lovely carvings that were put into the Victorian building of angels, and if I shine my torch on them, you can see them a bit better. Lovely angels with instruments, probably inspired by Psalm 150, which talks about use all the different instruments to praise God. And it's so often we think of churches and organs, but interesting, look, they've got lutes, and they've got drums and tambourines, and that looks like a harp of some sort. Yeah, a washboard maybe, yeah. The thought was that you put these angels in above the choir to help the choir in the worship of God, or more cynically they say if the choir sounded awful, at least hopefully the angels sound a bit better. The choir stalls behind you, in a very contemporary kind of thing actually, were actually recycled from wood that they found in the medieval building. So some of this in a sense goes way back to the 13th century.
I like standing.
You're standing on Victorian Minton tiles, and some of the artwork is particularly there are some of what became the coat of arms of the city of Birmingham. Over this side, if you, as people came to kneel to receive their Holy Communion, some of the little artwork on the floor shows a shield, and inside the shield is a crown of thorns, the nails and the hammer that were used to crucify Jesus, and the swords and the spear that were used to pierce his side. So that as people knelt to receive their Holy Communion, they would be reminded of the suffering that Jesus went through for them. These tiles are probably now irreplaceable. Many of the specialists who deal with these kind of buildings say you can't get these tiles, you just can't get them. So I don't know what you'd ever do. You couldn't replace them really. So
Beautiful.
it's also worth turning and having a look at our roof.
Oh, sorry.
And I think the roof in some ways is one of my favourite bits of the building. It's inspired by the roof of Westminster Hall. Westminster Hall is the oldest part of the Palace of Westminster.
Okay.
That goes way, way back, and it's an extraordinary piece of architecture. And people are just stunned that they could ever build it back in that generation. This is a Victorian copy. Chatwin was doing some work down in Westminster with Pugin, who was another very famous architect. Had obviously seen stuff in Westminster Abbey and Westminster Hall and brought back the concept and the design for his design for St Martin and the Bullring. And so that's why we have this incredibly elegant and beautiful roof. It is also quite extraordinary. It's 94.5 tons of timber hanging up there.
You know what this is for?
Which kind of makes you nervous about sitting underneath it. I have no idea. I suspect it must be.
Yeah.
I suspect it must be.
And then there's lead on top of that.
So then there'll be tiles on. Yes,
Tiles.
there will be some lead and tiles
Tiles,
as well. Yeah, yeah. But I think it's rather beautiful, and I rather like it.
So is it a pitched roof then? It goes up to a pitch, or is it an angle?
Yes. So the measurements, I've got the measurements for this one. So the span is 6.7 metres at the base, and then obviously it comes to a point, an apex. It's just over 30 metres long, and it's about 18 metres above the ground.
Right. Yeah.
To give you some
That's good
sense of
perspective,
scale.
Yeah,
Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So that one I have got the measurements for.
Yeah.
So quite.
And Westminster Hall, knights used to ride in on horseback, haven't
Yes,
they? And
yes.
Charles I was
That's right,
tried
Charles.
there.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. They came in and
Absolutely fascinating.
famously he just he didn't really acknowledge their authority to try him at all, did he?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Shall we move on? Are you okay? So watch
Yeah,
the steps.
two
We're going to
steps
move
down.
on.
Oh, come on, sorry, square on.
Yeah.
That's it.
Just mind yourself as you go. So.
Step down again.
So this is our most famous window in what we call the south transept. So this is, if you imagine the spur of the cross going across. And the reason this is famous for two reasons. It's the only one that survived. And the reason it survived was, as the air raids began, the then Bishop of Birmingham came into St Martin's and said, you need to get that window out. And so they took it down and they put it into wooden crates, and it was going to be taken off to some farm, I believe in Warwickshire somewhere, for safekeeping away from the city. The story goes, and I believe this is well testified, that it was still in the wooden boxes sat on the floor here the very next night when the bombs were dropped and all the other windows were shattered. That window was saved within 24 hours. And it's famous because it was designed by Edward Burnes-Jones and then crafted by William Morris, and both of them were very, very important figures in the history of art. One at the top, it just looks like a Verandam sort of picture. You can't actually see it, but this is the one that schoolchildren love, because if I now shine the torch on it, you'll see that actually there is a rather gruesome picture of the Grim Reaper, a skeleton with a scythe So the kids love that because they say it's the spooky one. There are a number of quite significant war memorials on the lower level, and on Remembrance Sunday, wreaths are always laid here. One of them particularly is quite interesting, relates to the Old Contemptibles, who were a very important Midlands regiment from the First World War. And the Old Contemptibles Association always come and hold a little service here every year as well. Also here on the wall, rather mysteriously, is this memorial in memory of Reverend William Thompson, who was the first president of the Wesleyan Methodist Conference. Why that's ended up in an Anglican church here in Birmingham, we have no idea. It says it was after the death of John Wesley. Of course, John Wesley was an Anglican. He never meant to set up a separate denomination. Methodism was a form of Christianity within the Anglican Church. But he was a very controversial figure, John Wesley. And the story goes that when John Wesley turned up here in Birmingham and was preaching in the markets outside, the rector at the time was so affronted and so cross that he told the bell ringers to ring the bells as long and as loud as they possibly could to drown him out so that nobody could hear him.
No, my mother's side of the family were staunch Methodists.
Yes.
And I was christened a Methodist at Central Hall in Birmingham.
Yes.
But I've never practiced, and
Yes.
I've never quite understood what is the fun. Yeah, why would they be loggerheads like that with the Anglican Church?
Well, it's a really good question, and it's difficult to give a simple answer.
Not for now, then.
No, but it's, I'll try and do
That's
it.
my Google Home
Yes,
speaker.
in a nutshell, they were a reform movement within the Church of England. And Wesley was concerned that the Church of England had lost its way a little bit, and they'd lost a true spirituality. And so he also felt that they weren't reaching out to the working people. So the Wesleys were very famous for travelling on horseback, going to mining areas, industrial areas, and preaching out on the streets. They took, if you like, the message of the Christian faith out of the church building and out onto the streets. And so that was where their big concern was. And Charles Wesley wrote loads and loads of hymns that are very famous now. And the reason they wrote them is because most people were illiterate. So if they were going to remember the story, the best way to remember the story was to sing a song. So he would write hymns that were all about the Christian faith. Hark the Herald Angels Sing. So Christmas Carol, he wrote that as a way of helping them to understand what the Christmas story was all about. Yeah. So that's what he tended to do. John also wrote some of the hymns. But Methodism then came out because they felt that the Church of England wasn't willing to reform. And so some of them decided that they would set up their own denomination that would give particular emphasis to things like personal spirituality, the reading of the Bible, and there were certain things such as not supposed to drink alcohol.
Sobriety was a big thing.
So these were all characteristics of Methodism. Of course, interestingly now, the Methodist Church and the Anglican Church are growing ever and ever back closer together because actually really they are, well, all Christian denominations are just part of a different family.
And do I remember it correctly that Methodist ministers didn't wear a dog collar?
Well, in the early days they would have worn preaching tabs.
Okay.
But a lot of them do wear dog collars. Yeah,
they do. Okay.
There are not a massive amount of differences between Methodists. They don't have bishops. And a lot of the problem now about reconciling the two is about the leadership, and they have a structure without bishops. We have bishops and bishops with authority. Otherwise, I think actually the two churches would merge again. But it's quite tricky. It's quite complicated. I always say to people, if you think of the church and you say, why have you got all these different denominations? I say, well, have you got brothers and sisters? Yeah, okay. So when you all grow up and you get married, you're still all brothers and sisters, but you'll all do things slightly differently. And your own family, your own way will do things. And even if you all get on really, really well, you'll all still do things slightly differently. You bring up your children differently, you cook different meals, you're still a family. And in some ways, that's the best way to explain how we've ended up with all these Christian denominations, which is a bit of a mess, really. But it's where different parts of the family have wanted to go off and do certain things differently at different times. But just as Martin Luther he was always a Roman Catholic priest. He never wanted to break away from the Roman Catholic Church. He wanted to change the Roman Catholic Church. But in the end, they felt that they couldn't do that, so they broke away. And that's why you end up with the Lutheran Church. The Church of England is a bit more complicated because it was never done for spiritual reasons, it was done for political reasons. And Henry and his desire of a divorce and all that kind of thing. But if we move over to the other side, here we have the pulpit, and the pulpit was used for preaching. They were built like this because obviously we didn't have sound amplification back then, so the only way to do it was to lift yourself up a bit higher so that you could be seen and heard. It's not a particularly elegant pulpit. It does have no real architectural merit to it at all. The figures on it represent Moses, Jesus, Peter and Paul, and you can nearly always tell Peter in Christian art because in Christian art he's nearly always holding keys. And that because from the gospel message, Jesus said, you will inherit the keys. Hence the stories about Peter early days letting people in, not letting people in. But it also has very theological significance in terms of some of the things that you were just talking about. And that's why even now the Bishop of Rome, or as we often call him, the Pope, is considered to have inherited that same authority directly from Peter. And that's why the Roman Catholic Church still say that they are the one true church, because they were the ones who inherited that authority from Peter.
And St. Peter's Basilica, also has the keyhole-shaped courtyard.
Yes, absolutely. Very much symbolic of the same thing.
And that's my Christian name.
What I find more interesting about this pulpit is some of the people who've preached in it. And there are a number of very famous, but interestingly, in 1925, a member of the Cadbury family, and you know that Cadburys were non-conformists, they were not Anglicans at all. And Dame Elizabeth Cadbury came to preach here in 1925 as president of the Evangelical Free Churches. Now, the fact that St Martin's let somebody from that background come and preach is very significant. The fact that it was a woman is even more significant, and it's claimed that this is the first time a woman was ever allowed to preach from a pulpit in the Church of England here in St Martin's. Perhaps even more shockingly, in 1969, the then Roman Catholic Bishop of Birmingham, who was a Patrick Dwyer, was allowed to preach from here. And it is claimed that is the first time that a Roman Catholic was ever allowed to preach in an Anglican church.
Why though?
Because
Why
of the
was he
historic divisions between the Church of England and the Roman Catholic.
And
And we have to remember that in our history, because of the problems of our history, which all root back to Henry VIII, and the distrust of the Roman Catholic Church, Roman Catholics were treated appallingly in this country for a very long time because they were seen as a danger and potentially the enemy. The history is very, very complicated, and it's much more to do with politics, and it's much more to do with the royal family than it is to do with anything else.
It wasn't until the 20th century or something that people could hold office or
Yeah.
something be Catholic.
Well, even now, Prince Charles, the thing is, can you marry a Roman Catholic as the heir to the English throne? And that's all to do with the history of the monarchy, really. It's not really much else. It's really to do with the history of the monarchy.
Well, didn't Tony Blair convert to Catholicism after
He
he
did,
left office?
and he wouldn't do it until he left office because he was concerned it would cause too much controversy.
Oh, so that was his own
Yeah.
choice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Across to our side here, we have our organ. The organ is actually played from the console over there on that side behind the choir stalls, but the sound actually comes from here.
Bluetooth.
Yes, a bit like it, yeah, old-fashioned Bluetooth. Just an awful lot of cables under the ground, actually. What you can see here is really just the facade, and this is what you see in most churches and cathedrals. The actual real business goes on behind, and if you can see with the torch, you can see behind there is an enormous number of organ pipes playing all different sounds and notes, from tiny, tiny little pipes that make the very high-pitched notes to some that are actually the size of a small wardrobe, but probably 2 or 3 times as high, that play some of the bass notes. And it's all crammed in behind there. This was originally put in I think it was 1907, and then was refurbished in 54 and again in 2000. And we had a little bit of excitement this week in that a lady rang me up on Tuesday and said, I'm supposed to be playing an organ recital in Birmingham, and she said, but the trouble is I can't get in there to practice the organ. Is there any chance that I could come into St Martin's and just do a little bit of practice? So I said, well, the trouble is we've got a service on. I said, but it might be possible. Let me see what we can do. So she turned up, and she came and played the organ for about 2 hours on Tuesday afternoon. And it turns out that she's a very famous organist from around the world, which we didn't know anything of. And she's here playing a series of conferences. I was going to try and get it on my phone to show you, but it won't come up. She's here playing a series of concerts with the City Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, playing the organ at Symphony Hall, and we didn't have a clue who she was. And it was quite interesting because 2 of the people on the last tour had actually come to Birmingham to hear her play in a concert last night. So there we are. That's just
David, I love that painting.
yeah, so this is our triptych. St Martin's, particularly in the modern era, has had a reputation of supporting the arts and being involved in contemporary art. A triptych is a 3-panelled work of art. Normally they fold, and you see them a lot actually in churches in mainland Europe, often up behind altars, and they're often associated also with iconography from the Orthodox tradition. This is a very contemporary triptych, and it's representing the crucifixion of Jesus. So the bough of the branch going across is the crossbeam of the cross on which he was crucified. The sort of ethereal robe hanging down represents the body of Jesus' dying body. And then you have 2 magpies. So I love to ask people, why 2 magpies? Well,
two for joy.
yeah,
Resurrection.
that's good, but it's
the
not
criminals
what she
off the
meant.
other side.
Yeah. So in British culture, magpies are always seen as thieves. And so the 2 magpies represent the 2 thieves that were crucified with Jesus either side of them. So that was painted by a contemporary artist called Caroline Pigden.
That is beautiful.
Yeah,
Colours and everything.
it's quite stunning colours, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. There's a real richness to it, I think, isn't there? A depth. So.
How big is this one?
So again, that's about what, 7 foot tall,
Yeah.
7 to 8 foot tall, and probably actually slightly wider at the crossbeam. So to give you a sense of scale.
Really lovely.
But if we have to wander on.
Yep.
So this was originally a design by an artist called Henry Hardman, and what they tried to do, in contrast to the one at the other end, which is a very contemporary design, this was they tried to reimagine what was there before. And this is very much influenced by the book of Revelation that comes at the end of the Bible, and a sense of Christian imagery, of the importance of Christ. And so there Christ is central, seated on the throne. As you come down, there's a figure there looking rather scary with a big sword, and I think that's probably supposed to represent St Michael, the Archangel, St Michael. Around Christ you can see various figures who represent the apostles, the saints, the martyrs who are worshipping Christ in heaven along with the angels. And then underneath that you can see a semicircle of blue, and if you look carefully, they are buildings, they are representing the cities of the world. And then below them are various authority figures, including those in crowns and robes. And this is to represent that actually ultimately everybody will have to acknowledge the authority of Christ as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, including all those who would consider themselves the powerful people of the world, who are left there at the bottom under the authority of Christ. So it's a rather dramatic design.
Now, the Archangel,
St Michael, or Michael the Archangel.
yeah.
So
That's new to.
So if you know the book of Revelation, he's quite a significant figure in fighting the devil and fighting evil. It's symbolic.
So he's a warrior, eh?
Yes. Yeah. Often seen as the kind of captain of the heavens armies in popular kind of artistry. So
If I knew about that, I'd forgotten. But yeah, that didn't ring a bell.
it's not an important particular part of the Christian faith.
Sounds like a good guy.
Well, it's supposed to be good to have him on your side. That's the idea. So
I'm sorry, Joe, the top bit where it's very red,
yes.
are they supposed to be roses or what?
No, they are actually faces and figures.
they are?
Yes. If you look very carefully, they are actually faces and figures as well. But what the imagery of and why they're in red, I don't know. If we can just go over, I'd like to show you a very different window in the corner. Bye, Marjorie. Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
Cheer on the look. All right.
Bye.
Just come behind me. Some places.
Yeah.
Now, this little window I really quite like, and it's very different in style. It's a much more recent piece of work. It comes from 1980. I don't know the name of the artist. Oh no, actually it does tell you. It's designed by somebody called Lawrence Lee, and it's a nativity scene. It's celebrating the birth of Christ. It was actually paid for by an elderly gentleman named Thomas Baggs, who by that point was 91 years old. He was born in 1889. But what's interesting about it is, one, notice the ethnic diversity of the faces and the figures in the window, which is quite different. But also, as a young man, he was a choir boy here in the Edwardian, late Victorian, early Edwardian times. And that's why you'll find, incorporated into the bottom of the window, is our own little Edwardian choir boy, who was supposed to represent Mr. Baggs as a young man in his own window, which I quite like. So that's rather lovely. So you'll also see here to your right is what was left of one of the bomb-damaged windows, to give you a sense of what would have been in the windows before they were all blown out. So the windows from the building were blown out by bombing in the Second World War. So that's why most of the windows are more recent.
That's very sort of bland compared to the, why? I mean, it's beautiful, but you know, it's not bright colours.
That would be much more, it's the style that would have been common at the time when this was built in the 1870s. So you get very different trends in art, you get very different trends in stained glass. And that would have been much more typical of that later Victorian style.
Yeah.
Not necessarily my favourite style, actually.
I mean, it's beautiful in its own right.
Yeah, and often would have been. It's interesting. It's a bit of a contrast between like the east and the west window. So the west window, although that's a newer one, it almost represents a slightly older style, which is almost a more pictorial and narrative style. It's telling stories from the Bible. Whereas this is much more sort of symbolic. It is from the Bible, but it's sort of representation of the saints and things like that, and great characters of the faith necessarily, rather than teaching something from the Bible. And that probably would have been very similar.
Yeah. It's somewhat like silvery grey.
Although again, as you see, lots and lots of angels with instruments again.
Yeah, got the old shadow there.
Yeah,
by the looks of
yeah,
it.
yeah.
Oh, lovely.
Well, is there a different style there?
Yeah, I mean,
It is a very different
it's
style.
a very, tamed colour scheme compared to the others. So.
I don't think you were with us when I was showing. Found it. So this was the building as it was damaged as the bombs came down. That gap there is that window there. So you can see these are literally bits of glass that they just picked up off the floor and managed to put back in. But you can also see where the great big west window was. It's just a great big gaping hole where all the glass had shattered.
Was it just the windows that were blown
Yeah,
out?
thankfully. There was a little bit of damage. We're going to go through into prayer chapel in a moment. There was a little bit of structural damage at that end, but most of the building itself, in terms of the structure, was fine. It was just the blasts around that causes the glass to shatter.
Okay.
It's something that a lot of people don't realise. It even happened with, you may remember the huge IRA bomb that exploded in the Isle of Dogs probably, 30 years ago now? The biggest damage was actually to the windows from buildings literally up to about a mile and a half around. So people's homes, the blocks of flats, the office blocks, it was all the glass shattered. And it's the reverberations of the explosion that causes that. So.
Okay.
That happened all across the I'm not doing
Okay. If we come on over to just like to show you a few more bits. So here we have our font. And I don't know whether you know anything about fonts, but fonts are the place where people are baptised. Fonts traditionally within this kind of church would normally be placed near the door because fonts are used for baptisms, and baptism is symbolic of joining the church, being welcomed into the church.
Can Peter touch this?
Yes, please do. Yeah. And this is a contemporary installation. So if I just explain a little bit of the history. When this Bullring development was put in around 2000, they decided it was an opportunity to do quite a bit of work on the church. So actually the outside of the church had become incredibly dirty from pollution. It was, you may remember from, it was almost black like your coat. And so they washed off the whole of the outside of the building and cleaned it up, which is fantastic. The only problem is that now having done that, the moss really loves the clean church, and so now it's going green instead of black, but there we are. So then they also did a number of things internally in terms of cleaning all the stone in here, so that's much brighter in here than it used to be, and again, better lighting. And then things like these contemporary art installations. So this was by an artist called Jacqueline Gruber-Steiger. This was put in 2003. And really it's designed as a waterfall. So the water comes out at the top and it cascades down to the various levels until it pools at the bottom and then it comes round. We had to take the water out as a COVID health protection because people come in, dip their fingers in the water and cross themselves, and so we were told that was a health hazard, so we had to take the water out for the time being. But we do still use it for baptisms, and I think it's rather lovely. I like it very much. So. And then I want to take you through to the last bit of the building I'd like to show you. So we simply call this our prayer chapel, and it is a place where people still come every day to pray. You'll see here at the heart of it is our candle stand. Again, this is another contemporary piece of artwork. This was designed by somebody called Anthony Robinson and was put in 2000. And the idea is the metal structure is supposed to be representative of the flame of the candle, which people light to offer their prayers to God. And literally we have hundreds of people coming to light candles every day. We get through an enormous number of candles and there's a lot of wax all the time. Also, if you look up there, I call this our Marmite window, and people tend to either love it or loathe it. And this is the most recent addition to the building. This was fitted in 2016 and it was designed by a Scottish artist known as John Ronald Craigie Aitchison. Sadly, he died before the window was actually installed. But it was his design, and obviously is a very contemporary, simple depiction of the crucifixion of Jesus. As I say, some people tend to love it, others go, oh, I don't like that, because it's very, very different. But it's one of the things I do like about St Martin's building is that we do have such a huge range of stained glass, such a great variety to see. This is also a place where people's cremated remains can also be interred. So under the floor here, there's a significant amount of cremated ashes and remains, and some of the names of the people whose remains have been placed are there on those memorial boards. I think you've missed the tours for the bell chamber today. I think they're finished, but if anybody's interested in coming back tomorrow, they will be doing tours of the bell chamber, so you can go up. They are very steep, winding spiral staircase, but you can go up into the ringing chamber and they'll explain to you the history of the bells here at St Martin's and how they do that. So if anybody's interested, you can do that tomorrow. Just very quickly, therefore, this is in some ways is the oldest part of the building. Has been restored at various points, but some of this goes back to the original medieval church. Above us, the wooden floor that you can see above there is a beautiful panelled room in which all the ropes for the bells are. Then the bells themselves are much higher up and they go up into the spire. We're certainly unique in the United Kingdom in having 16 bells in our bell tower. We believe there are only 3 churches in the whole world, and that's including cathedrals, that have 16 bells. It's very, very unusual. And I'm very proud to say, because it's nothing to do with me, but we also have some of the most accomplished bell ringers actually in the UK. And people come here to ring with them and to visit and to see what they do. They really are quite special. I mentioned about the fact that ashes under the floor. Where we were on the other side, when we were looking at the nativity window, under the floor there is also a crypt, and there are a significant number of human remains under there. We don't know exactly when that dates from. I think you were asking about churchyards. So there used to be a smallish churchyard around the outside of St Martin's. But as the city grew and the population grew and this became the heart of a very busy, bustling city centre, there was never any room for that. And so in the mid-Victorian era, they opened up a new graveyard, which was the other side of Moore Street Station, and that became the graveyard for St Martin's for a while, but again, only for a short while because it filled up pretty quickly. It then just became a park. It's now where they're building the brand new HS2 station. And so what had to be agreed was when that site was designated for the new station, permission had to be given from the National Church of England and from St Martin's for those bodies to be exhumed. And so they went to enormous lengths to dig up every single bone. And when I say every single bone, literally they went through the whole ground, and even tiny little finger bones and toe bones were taken out of the ground and kept and reinterred.
Normally is it cremations or is it a bit of both?
Either. Yes, in Anglican there's no strong way or the other. Either is done. So there's no particular strong tradition either way. So yeah.
And those bones being reinterred, where to?
Well, that's the bit we haven't heard.
So they're in storage now?
So at the moment they're still all in storage, yeah. Yeah. Apparently there was a very good BBC programme about it, which I haven't seen.
Our friends
so,
were talking about this last night.
yeah. So, and they talked about the other end, it's the same at King's Cross end, there was also a very large graveyard. But we were invited over, and I went personally on 3 occasions to see what they were doing, so that they could try to demonstrate the care and the thoughtfulness with which the whole process was being handled. So originally it was archaeologists, but only for a certain part of it. So that was the agreement, that archaeology would be funded for a certain period of time to work in a certain area. So yes, they worked in great detail and they did a lot of research, and all of that was documented at great length. After that, then they brought in specialist exhumation companies, but they're not archaeologists.
Okay. I didn't know that either.
Yeah, no, I didn't either, but yeah, they do. But their job was to make sure that the bones were properly removed from the ground before any building work could be done. When you came into the church today, you came in through the main doors, and then you come through a sort of metal and glass structure. That was again part of the internal refurbishment of the church in the 2000s. What you're looking at now is what would have been the original entrance as you came through the door, this wooden panelling. Personally, I think it's a bit of a shame they didn't keep it, but there we are. What's interesting about it, and what I wanted to show you, is all the wooden carving.
Yeah.
Because this represents all the fruit and vegetables that could be bought out in the market outside. And the reason I wanted to end with this is because actually these wooden panels were paid for by the market traders. And it was part of the relationship between St Martin's Church and the Bullring market. And if you remember, we began our tour by saying Birmingham began between the relationship between the market and the church. And in a sense, at the heart of Birmingham has always been that relationship between St Martin's and the local traders and the market and shopping area, the shoppers as well as the traders. And that's part of the history of this church, and it's part of the history of our city. So that's why I wanted to end with that, because it kind of brings us round full circle. We began with a market and a church, and so we end with a market and a church.
Fascinating.
And what you were saying earlier, if I've got the angles right, is this underneath the bell
So
tower?
you're now, that's right. So right above your head is the bell ringing chamber, and then a long way up from there are the bells. With 16 bells, that takes up a lot of space. And the biggest one is about 2 tons in weight.
A lot of weight as well.
Huge amounts of weight. Unfortunately, it can be potentially very dangerous. So very few people go up to where the bells actually are. But I have had the privilege of going up and having a nose round, right up into the spire. But it is quite something. It really is quite something.
I mean, obviously you wouldn't go up there.
I'm not
But,
going anywhere.
but if you imagine, if you can imagine some very, very large steel girders, very hefty steel girders, so that as you get up high into the tower, it's lined with this kind of framework of these huge steel girders, and it's to those that the bells are attached. But the fact that actually some of this tower dates back to medieval times and it's still strong enough to hold all that weight of 16 bells and the movement, because the building will move as those bells swing. If you think 2 tons swinging round, and you're multiplying that, they're not all 2 tons in weight, but you multiply that 16 times, that's an awful lot of forces going on. Yeah. But a lot of these old buildings, they have to be built with flexibility, otherwise they fall down.